All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started here. Today, we've got an awesome webinar for you and a couple of great hosts. We've got a Hitchhikers exclusive webinar. This is part of our deep dive series after the spring release webinar. And today, we've got how to enhance your knowledge graph with relationships. I'm really excited for this webinar because as you all know, if you've worked with Yext, the knowledge graph is the foundation to everything that we do and the foundation to building amazing experiences. And we've added a couple of great enhancements that are going to make it even easier to build out your knowledge graph, build out the relationships between those entities. So today I want to introduce our two speakers. We've got Curtis and Jesse from the platform product marketing team and the product management team covering the knowledge graph. So I want to turn it over to Curtis and help you kick things off.
Thanks, Nick. And hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We're really excited for the opportunity to talk about some of the hard work that came out of the spring 2022 release. As far as a quick agenda goes, we want to get started by discussing, why relationships are important. Why are we having this webinar? And then transition that into taking a look at, how we used to manage relationships in the knowledge graph and how we are now going to approach them going forward. After that, we'll talk more about some best practices with a little bit of a demo about how you can build relationships in the knowledge graph. And then we'll answer some frequently asked questions that we think are important to take away from this webinar, and then open it up for a Q&A for any user questions that come in. So with that said, let's get started talking about relationships. As Nick had just mentioned, and I'm sure as many of you who've joined a Hitchhikers webinar before have heard, the knowledge graph really is the foundation of all of Yext's products and solutions. That's because the key to building amazing customer experiences is in how you store your data. A knowledge graph allows you to organize your business's data flexibly and in a way that really reflects your organization. This is all possible because knowledge graphs store relationships between data. This helps you power dynamic online experiences that take advantage of AI and natural language processing. So when it comes to relationships in the knowledge graph, it's important to recognize that they come in different forms. We have one-way relationships, and then there are also two-way relationships. One-way relationships tell us that entity A is related to entity B, but not the other way around. For instance, a one-way relationship could tell us that a product is related to a store where it's sold. But this would tell us nothing about the store's relationship to the product in the other direction. So in this way, one-way relationships are less flexible because relationship data can only be accessed in a single direction. On the other hand, two-way relationships tell us that two entities are related with one another in both directions. So that would mean that entity A is related to entity B, and that entity B is related to entity A. So for example, we could imagine two related products. The first is related to the second and vice versa. And relationships are really important, especially when you're modeling your data in the knowledge graph. There are kind of three key reasons that can help you understand why. The first is they allow you to organize your data much more flexibly. Relationships are an inherently important part to knowledge graphs because their connections provide an added layer of data that gives you a much more comprehensive view of your data set. For instance, if you're a hospital administrator, it's critical to track key details like the locations where your doctors practice, the specialties they treat, and more. And this is all made easy using relationships. Using relationships, you're able to build a knowledge graph that reflects the nuances of your brand's organization. And this makes it a much more effective platform to reach your customers online. Relationships also help you manage your brand's data much more efficiently. Since you can relate entities throughout the knowledge graph, it means that you don't need to duplicate data in your database for it to appear wherever it's needed. So for instance, imagine that your business offers the same service across multiple locations. The details of that service would only need to be entered in the knowledge graph once. And with relationships, that information can be surfaced wherever it's relevant in the knowledge graph. This also makes ongoing data management much easier because as you update your data over time, edits to a single entity will be reflected wherever that entity is used in your knowledge graph and in your downstream applications that are powered by the knowledge graph. And so, with that, relationships, as they're structured in the knowledge graph, also enable some really exciting natural language experiences in these downstream applications. By linking related data, your data set can be made searchable with natural language processing algorithms. So, for example, if you had an auto dealer knowledge graph with entities for locations, car models, and tires, then you'd be able to run a search for information on very specific combinations of those entities. So like which cars have Michelin tires at the Main Street location. Because of the knowledge graph structure, algorithms are able to interpret these questions semantically and use AI to traverse these relationships and then ultimately deliver the right answer to your customer. So, as we're talking about relationships, it's of course important to tell you a little bit more about like where we came from in order to better understand where we are today. Relationships have always been an integral part of the knowledge graph. And for that reason, we are always looking for ways they can be improved. In the spring 22 release, we had a major upgrade to our relationship architecture. So let's take a look a little bit at how things have changed. So originally, we were able to configure relationships using an entity list custom field type. Now, with an entity list field, users could assign a relationship in a single direction from one entity to another. While this was a good solution at the time, it lacked dedicated support for two-way relationships. So in order to build a two-way relationship with this structure, users had to create two entity list fields on either side of the relationship, pointing towards the other. We realized how this left room for some error. So for example, if a user forgot to add both sides of a relationship while they were intending to build a two-way relationship, then they would be in trouble or run into some error. We also realized that this could be way more efficient. And so that's why with this most recent release, we introduced the relationship custom field type that now replaced entity lists. So in addition to one-way relationships, which have been long supported, with the relationship custom field type, we now have support for two-way relationships. So when you add a two-way relationship now, whenever you're creating that relationship field, each entity that's involved in the relationship is automatically updated with the appropriate relationship data, including a backlink to its related counterpart in the knowledge graph. So, two-way relationships, they can also be configured in two ways that really help you get at the nuance of these relationships. You can use either a shared field or two distinct fields to describe the relationship. Let's take a look at what that means more specifically. When you're deciding whether to use a shared field or distinct fields, it's actually really helpful to consider the entity's point of reference. In either case, there's going to be a relationship field that lives on each entity, but based on the nature of that relationship, those fields can either be the same or be distinct. If the relationship looks the same to both entities, then it would make sense to use a shared field. So in this case, entity A's relationship to entity B is identical to entity B's relationship to entity A. For instance, again, imagine you had two related products. For each entity, they view the other as simply a related product. The relationship looks the same from either entity's point of view. And so building this relationship in the knowledge graph is a more simple option. You can use a shared field to describe their relationship on both ends, and it will work perfectly. But this isn't always the case. sometimes relationships will look different on either side. So for example, let's say we have a relationship between a doctor and a hospital where they practice. For the doctor, they relate to that hospital as, like I said, a location where they practice. But for the hospital, the doctor is a member of its staff. This relationship is semantically different on each side. And so because of that, it requires distinct fields to accurately represent it in the knowledge graph. This distinction is really important. It lets you be even more precise when organizing your brand's data, which in turn allows you to build even more powerful experiences with the knowledge graph. So with that all said, let's take a look at what's possible using one-way and two-way relationships in the knowledge graph. I'm going to pass it over to Jesse to give us some more context and a little demo to see how this works under the hood.
Perfect. Thanks, Curtis. Let's see if I can figure out how to start sharing my screen here. Cool. So I think we're looking at the right slide here. So building better relationships. So I'm going to take you all through a demo and we're looking, you guys can see my screen here, right? With the, if I pull up this.
Looks good, Jesse.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. Always an issue sharing screen. So I want to take you through a demo of sort of, as Curtis mentioned, there are 3 types of relationships that we think of, and I want to take you through how you would actually build those relationships in the knowledge graph, how to think about those. So we're going to start with the one-way relationship, which, as Curtis mentioned, is very similar to our existing entity list functionality that we had previous to this release. But I think that it's important to showcase that in order to hammer home kind of what has changed. So we'll start there. So when you think about a one-way relationship, you're thinking about relating data in one direction. And that's useful if you only need to access the information in a single direction. So in this example, I'm thinking about a location and a set of locations that's related to an organization. And that would be useful, let's say, if I wanted to build a page for every location and I wanted to include details that are stored on that organization entity. So for instance, maybe it's the brand name and the brand logo and a mission statement or something like that. And I wanted that on every page for every location. Again, I wouldn't want to duplicate that data on every single location entity. So I would use relationships, but I might not ever need an organization page that has a list of all the locations. So in that case, a one-way relationship might be sufficient. So in order to do so, I've created a knowledge graph that has those entities that I mentioned. So we have this Turtlehead Corporation and 2 locations here, 2 restaurants, and I want to create that one-way relationship. So I'm going to go into our fields UI here, and I'm going to go ahead and create a relationship field from scratch, a one-way relationship. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll go through this flow and I'll select my field type. And my field type here is entity relationship. Now I have the choice of, do I want to pick a one-way relationship and a two-way relationship? And so for this particular example, we're going to go with one-way. So now I want to set up that field. So I'm going to say that the name of that field is parent brand, and I'm going to enable that field on the restaurant entity type. So when I go to the restaurant entity type now, part of that types schema is going to be this parent brand one-way relationship field. And I might set some validation as well, the supported destination entity types here. So I only want you to be able to choose organizations as the recipient of this relationship, essentially, like the related entity. So I'll go ahead and I'll save that. And now when I go to that restaurant entity, either one of those Turtlehead Tacos locations, I can find that field, brand, I think I called it parent brand, and it's in the other field section right now because I haven't changed the way that it's set up in my presentation there. And I'm going to be able to select the Turtlehead Corporation. So now if I wanted to create, as I mentioned, create a page, search for the restaurant and include organization data there, I would be able to not only have information from this particular Turtlehead Tacos entity, but also from the related Turtlehead Corporation entity. So that is a one-way relationship. Now you can see that when I go to this organization entity, there isn't a corresponding field that points back to that Turtlehead Tacos location. So if I did want that bi-directional relationship, if I wanted to be able to have a page for an organization that lists all of the restaurants that are associated with that organization, then I would want to use two-way relationships. So that segues nicely into the next demo, which will be a two-way relationship. So this next example we're going to jump into is a two-way relationship using a shared field. So I always find that it's a little bit easier to explain these things when we have concrete examples that we want to use. So in this case, we're going to use the example that Curtis brought up, which is two related products. So if I were building a knowledge graph for Nike and I wanted to relate two products, the Air Max 97 and the Air Max 95, I would want to create a two-way relationship field called related products. And in that field, whenever I populated one side of the relationship, it would be populated in the other direction as well. So let's go through that flow. So again, I have a set of entities. I actually have 3 entities here, all of which are products. And there's 3 shoes here. So if I go through the same flow of creating that related products field, and then I populate that data on those entities, it should populate those backlinks for me. So I'm going to go through this relationship flow, and this time I'm going to select two-way, and now I change my field configuration, or I select my field configuration here. So in this case, we're going to do a shared field because on both sides of that relationship, if I look at a product, I want to see the related products. So we only need one field to represent that relationship. So let's say that this is related products. And again, I'm going to choose the availability of that field. So that's going to be product. And in this case, I don't need to choose destination entity types because this field is going to be available on both sides of the relationship. So the destination entity types are implied by the field availability here. So that might make a little more sense once I show the example. So I will save that. And now when I go back and I pick a particular product entity, for this example, we're going to start with the Air Max 95. And I'm going to go to the related products field that I just created. And I want to say actually that it's related to both the Air Max 270 and the Air Max 97, because on every answers result card for this particular product, I want to be able to show the related products, and all of these are part of the same family. So I'm going to save those. And now when I go to the Air Max 270, for example, I'm going to see that not only is the relationship pointing from this entity to this entity, but there's also a backlink populated in the related products field here for that Air Max 95. So rather than having to maintain 2 separate sides of this relationship, it's maintained for us. And then if I wanted to close the loop here and say, now this is also related to the Air Max 97, just so that all 3 of those entity type or those entities are all related to one another. Now, if I selected any of these, I should see the other 2 Air Maxes that we have as related entities in their particular related products field. So yeah, just a lot more simple flow for data management there and for managing those relationships. The last example that I want to go through is using distinct fields for a two-way relationship. So as Curtis mentioned, this is really useful when there's kind of a semantic difference about a semantic difference regarding how you think about the relationship on each side. So if I'm relating doctors and facilities, to the doctor, the relationship is the practicing locations. When I look at that doctor, I want to say, hey, what's the name for the practicing location, or what's the description? When I look at the hospital, I want to say, what's the staff, the list of people that work there, and I may want a full list of those. I may want specific information about each one of those. So in this case, what I would do is create a two-way relationship with distinct fields. So again, I'm going to go through that same field configuration flow, but my selection is going to be slightly different. So I will go through entity relationship, and this time I'm going to select distinct fields. So now I want to define the field that's going to be on each side of that relationship. So the first thing is the practicing locations, and this is going to be available to my healthcare professional entity type. And then I'm going to select the staff, or I'm going to create the staff field, and this is going to be available to my healthcare facility type. And now I'll go ahead and save that. So what I did there was I actually created 2 fields under the hood that are part of one relationship. I created the practicing locations field and the staff field. And so now the practicing location fields is available on the healthcare professional entity type, and the staff field is available on the healthcare facility entity type. And those are part of one group. So if I went from either direction, if I wanted to select healthcare professional, and I have our Dr. Curtis Mar here, And I'm going to go ahead and say that his practicing locations include, so this is the field that's on the healthcare professional entity type. We've enabled that as part of the schema. His practicing locations include Yext General Hospital. Now, when I go into Yext General Hospital, I will see the backlink populated, but it will be in the relevant field that's the other half of that relationship. And it's a distinct field. It's not the same. It's that staff field that I created. So we should see a staff field, and it has Dr. Curtis Marr here populated as part of the staff. So that is kind of a demo of exactly how you would configure those relationships. I think that's kind of sufficient. If we have some time, maybe at the end here, I can show actually like how we'd go about fetching that data across those relationships. So if I wanted to, just for an example, as I've been saying, like build a page or make an answers experience that searches across related data, I can show an API request so that we can see kind of how that data is materialized across those relationships. But I think that I'll jump back to Curtis for now. We'll finish the rest of this presentation. And if we have time later, I can jump into that.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse. And let's go ahead. I will bring us back to the deck. That was really helpful. I find it's always, it's always so much easier to understand how these things work when you see somebody build it right in front of you. So thank you again. All right, everybody. So I think now we should have the screen back. We wanted to just spend a little time, following the demo, maybe getting ahead of some commonly asked or some expected questions that we would hear from our users. So let's just get started, and Jesse and I will kind of share a few questions. And while we're talking through these, if it sparks any creativity in any of your minds to ask any additional questions, we'll be looking forward to answer those right after. So, the first one that we have here that we just want to make sure is clear to everybody is, how do I decide between using a shared field or distinct fields when adding a two-way relationship? So, a quick answer there is really, when you create a relationship in the knowledge graph, you got to remember that you're populating a field on each entity. And on that entity, you're describing the relationship it has to the other. So if that relationship can be described using the same field, meaning that the relationship looks the same to either entity on each side, then it makes sense to use a shared field. But often when you're relating two entities of the same type, that means that the shared field will make sense. But in other situations, using a distinct field when the relationship has some semantic difference, that's more of an appropriate fit. So I think that is kind of a good start. And if there's any additional questions, please follow up in the Q&A section of our Zoom. And let's move on to the next FAQ here. How do I build relationships at scale? Jesse, do you want to handle that one?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is a really great question. I think that the way to think about this is, so actually creating the relationship fields is kind of a set and forget type of action. Like, it's part of your business's schema and it's part of your Yext account schema. So you're going to really create, like in that example that I had, where you figure out how you want to relate doctors and facilities, and you set up that relationship. Once that relationship is set and enabled on your entity types, like, you'll have access to actually set that data in those fields on all of your entity types freely. So the schema configuration is more of a one-time, I'm thinking about how my business data all fits together and how I want to think about this. I'm going to create these fields and we'll go from there. And you won't have to really manage those fields beyond that. And then at that point, it's just data population, the same way that you would populate data for any other field in Yext. So you obviously want to be specific about the entities that you relate to one another. You want to make sure that the doctors that practice at the facilities are accurate to your business, and you wouldn't want to maybe just bulk edit all of your entities and say all of them are related to all of the other entities of a certain type, because that wouldn't be accurate to your business. But you can use any other of our standard tools for data management in order to populate that relationship data. So whether that's single entity edit or it's upload or it's connectors, or it's the API, or it's bulk edit if you can select the right set of locations to bulk edit. Like all of our tools work the same way. We just think about it as editing data. So yeah, I would say that the ingestion mechanism, like if you want to use a bulk ingestion mechanism, that would kind of require that in your source system, you have a model that matches what's in Yext, because otherwise you wouldn't know which entities to relate to one another. But if you have one of those, then API bulk upload connectors are great. Otherwise, you can always use Yext as kind of your source of truth and handle modeling the data directly in there. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great. And then the last one that we put out in front of us here is, what limitations are there when using relationships? So a quick answer there. It's really, when you're thinking about relationships, these are not applicable to location listings right now. It's also worth noting that at this point, we don't have first-class support for storing data on relationships themselves. So for instance, that could be something like the price or stock status of a specific product as it relates to a certain location where it's in stock. At this point, we don't have support for supplying the info on the relationship itself. There are a couple of workaround solutions that we can put together, but in terms of a first-class support solution, we're in the progress of trying to understand how we can do this best. And if it works out, we're going to add it to our relationships architecture. So those are our predetermined FAQs. But luckily, we have our Q&A coming up right after. And so please, if you have any questions that would help you better understand how relationships work in Yext, please enter them there and we'll answer them to the best of our ability. While I give you all some time to kind of think through your questions, enter them, I just want to do a quick plug for a few things, Hitchhikers. So in terms of upcoming events, we have our next bi-weekly Hitchhikers office hours coming up on the 17th. Looking ahead after that, we have a webinar for listings, getting into the granular details with listings, May 18th. And then we have some more regularly scheduled content, some platform basics and coding clinics that go into analytics, our answers React components, and then navigating the platform, all in the month of May. So please mark your calendars and we look forward to seeing you there. One additional note while we're waiting for more questions, I do just want to plug that the product team is in the process of releasing a blog post about relationships that should be out by the end of the day today. We're really excited. Please share any feedback that you have and be sure to take a look and learn more about relationships there. Let's get started with some Q&A. I see we have questions coming in. The first one here is, so how do I decide between using one-way or two-way relationships? Jesse, do you want to take that one on?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So I think that we kind of emphasize this throughout, but I would say that a one-way relationship is an apt decision if you are sure that you only ever want to access data in a certain direction. So from the example that I had for locations and organizations, like if I was 100% sure that there's no reason for me to ever need to look at all of the locations that are related to a particular organization, then it would be fine to have a one-way relationship from the locations to the organization. But if you ever would want to be able to access the data in both directions, if you ever wanted to build a page or search in both directions, then we would always recommend, I think, using two-way relationships. So for the most part, I would say, like, unless you've thought through all the details and it's clear that you'll only ever want to access the data in a single direction, two-way relationships are probably the safer, more flexible bet. So that would be my answer, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. And good question. Thank you. I see another question here. Are relationships geared mostly towards e-commerce? That's a great question. I think in terms of the product team's perspective on relationships, what we see is just such a wide number of different use cases. I think it's really easy for us to use examples of e-commerce because nowadays e-commerce is such a central part of our lives. But we do think when you're working, building a knowledge graph for complex organizations like, healthcare practices or financial services firms, relationships are also a really valuable tool there for connecting entities that are related and that work together to help users find answers and convert on your site and your online properties. So for example, like another example of a relationship would be like for a financial services firm, if you have a number of different financial products, whether they're credit cards or loans, you could relate those entities to relevant help articles or thought pieces that would help those users or those customers make informed decisions while they're navigating your online experience. So to answer the question, we see a wide number of use cases. E-commerce seems so familiar that it's easy to talk about it, but not to be cliche, but we do think the opportunities are kind of endless. And we're looking forward to see how this continues to grow in the community and all the exciting use cases that our users are going to put together. So hopefully that helped, and feel free to follow up in the chat if you've any follow-up questions that we can help with. Let's see here. So we have a question. Is there any limit to the number of relationships and entities that can be created in a knowledge graph? Are there any known performance limitations? Also happy to jump in there. We don't have any limits to the number of relationships or entities that you can create in the knowledge graph. I think, Jesse, you'd probably be a better person to ask about, any known performance limitations. None known to me, but feel free to correct me if I'm missing there.
Oh, that's accurate. Yeah, there's no performance limitations. It should be just as quick to search over related data. We could maybe do a deeper dive into like how our infrastructure works and how we actually like make sure that we don't actually like query the graph ever in a live fashion. So all of the data is kind of pre-indexed according to configurations that are set up basically like in your downstream system. So if you were building a page or building answers, we would index all the data that's all related. And then at query time, it's all in an index. So there's no performance limitations there.
Got it. That's very helpful. I see we also have a question here. How do you tailor relationships with multiple healthcare facilities under different brands and a variety of healthcare providers? Is there a module that goes into more detail? So I will say, not to shamelessly plug the blog once again, but we have a little bit more detail into how you can build relationships in the blog. And at the very end of the blog, we link out to a number of different Hitchhikers resources, including modules that give you step-by-step instructions about all of the implications and necessary steps to properly model relationships for your organization. But like as a more general note, in order to like properly structure relationships for a complex organization, you really just need to spend some time thinking about these relationships in advance of adding them, in order to just properly map out to the real life entities and those relationships that we're trying to reflect in the knowledge graph. Jesse, I'll pause if you have any additional commentary to help out there.
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it pretty well.
Cool. All right, let's see here. Well, we definitely do appreciate the activity. We got a number of questions here, so we're going to try to cover everything. So we had one that was, how would this relationship appear in, so the question was another one populated, so I missed it. How would this relationship appear in the knowledge graph? So I think we did look at that, but just at a high level, these relationships are populated inside fields on the entities that are involved in the relationship. So like any other field in your entity in the knowledge graph, you have to click into the field and click into the entity and find the appropriate relationship field. And there you'll see the linked entity that describes this relationship. All right, hopefully that's helpful. As I said before, any follow-up questions, we're here to answer them. Okay. Yeah, so we have a question, Jesse. What are live examples of Yext pages and or answers utilizing relationships? So we can definitely speak to some of what we've seen across the Hitchhikers community so far. When it comes to an answers experience, you could imagine a knowledge graph set up with a number of different related entities. And with a traditional database, it's hard to ask a question that deals with data that's structured hierarchically. But thanks to the knowledge graph, we lose that hierarchy that often gets in the way of answering questions. And with these relationships, we're able to traverse between entities and pull relevant information to answer questions. So, earlier in the webinar, I mentioned we had the auto dealer with different cars, different tires, and different locations. So with that information stored in the knowledge graph, our search algorithm is equipped to answer very specific questions that deal with starting at one entity, moving to another to pull information, and then moving to yet another to provide a comprehensive answer to the user's question. Jesse, do you want to hop in with a discussion of maybe how this would look in pages?
Yeah, I mean, so this is still in the context of live examples. I think, yeah, we probably, I don't think that we want to call out like specific customer experiences that are live necessarily, but it's the same idea. I mean, the data downstream, when I say downstream, I mean like outside of the knowledge graph, is kind of materialized as like a single record that has all of the related data included on it that you've asked for. So if I wanted to build a page that had, let's say that I set up a knowledge graph that it had a bunch of different hops, like it had a healthcare professional and the conditions that they specialized in, and those conditions had synonyms, and as you can think about kind of many different hops away. That's kind of how we talk about it, like entities away. So you could reference across all of those pieces, all those relationships, and then populate the data onto a single record and create a page for that. Let's say, so I want a specific landing page for a healthcare professional that has data from all of those different entity types all populated. So yeah, I'm a little hesitant to speak to like live customer examples, but that's the way to think about it. And it would be pretty simple to build that in answers or in pages.
Great, thanks. And I think you're very right in that we should be wary to share any proprietary information here, but yeah, that's a great example. Let's take a look at the remaining questions here. I think we're actually approaching a pretty, oh, we just got a new one here. Okay, that was more of a comment, but well, that totally works as well. Well, I will say if anybody has any additional questions to add here, we'll stay on for a little bit longer and be ready to answer them as they come in. Oh, so we had a question about, so I mentioned before that right now we don't support storing information on a relationship itself. And so when I was discussing that, I did mention that, we do have a workaround that works in describing how this information can be stored about a relationship. And so Jesse, we had a user who was asking, if we could just go over what that workaround would look like. And I think when discussing that, it'd be great to discuss like kind of the implications and why we don't consider this a first class option for support.
Yeah, for sure. So basically what we would be saying, what we would do is we would have a join entity that lives kind of in between two different entity types. So you can think of if you had products and locations and you wanted to store information that is specific to the relationship between the product and location, as Curtis mentioned. So like stock status or price of that, if the price varies based on the location that you're visiting. You could set up an entity type that's called maybe the join entity, and the join entity has those two fields on it. And instead of relating the products directly to the locations, although you could do both, you could relate the products and the locations and relate the join entity. What we'd probably recommend, the most kind of salient data structure would be you'd have the product on one side, you'd have a join entity in the middle, and these two would be related. And then you'd have the location on the other side, and that would also be related to the join entity in the middle. And then when I wanted to grab data that lived on that interim entity, I would need to, we haven't really discussed that much the actual syntax of referencing those fields. We use what's called dot notation, and I can show an example of that. But you would essentially request data for like, let's say I'm looking at the product. I would say product dot related location dot name. And then I would also say if they're the name, sorry, the related location, the join entity in the middle would have a way to like reference across to the next entity. So you could definitely do that. The only reason I think that we would say that it's not first class is one, like that join entity would show up in your knowledge graph as a regular entity. And maybe that's desirable, maybe it's not. We're kind of still figuring out what the best user experience is there. But you could think about like a world where there's a dedicated user interface for managing your relationship fields or something like that. But it would show up. So you'd see your products and your locations and your join entities all in your knowledge graph. And you would manage them the same way. And the other thing is that those would count towards your capacity of entities. You can think about like, if I had a product that was related to 2 locations, I would need 2 join entities in the middle. If I had a product that was related to 3 locations, I would need 3 join entities in the middle. So it can kind of exponentially increase the amount of entities that you need to store. So those would be the 2 reasons that that's not first class. But in terms of like getting the right data out of Yext and storing your data, there's kind of no difference there between our workaround and what a first class solution would look like. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Jesse. And yeah, I think this does really underlie a point that we made earlier, in that we're always working on improving the knowledge graph and in particular improving relationships. So, while this is something that we currently don't support, it's a possibility in the future. It's something that our teams will be working hard on to investigate and see what we can do. So I also see a question just following up on the blog that I had mentioned about where we can access it. I think maybe since I'm sharing my screen, it could be helpful just to quickly show you all how to access the blog. So what you're going to want to do is just go to hitchhikers.yext.com. And from there, you see my account. I'm a Voyager rank. And from there, you go to learn at the top navigation. Well, we can click into learn in the top navigation, and we move over to blog on the right in the resources section. And in the next 24 hours, I will say the blog will appear here. It'll be the most recent one. And so we're really excited for y'all to take a look and let us know in the community if you have any follow-up questions that we can add to help you better understand how to use relationships. Let's see, let's look at our other questions here. We do appreciate all the questions. It makes us feel glad to do the webinar. Let's see.
I could jump in, Curtis, about there seem to be 2 questions about Google business profile here. Should I answer those?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So I think that this goes to the point that Curtis mentioned earlier, which is that currently the dedicated relationship support that we are describing in this webinar isn't really applicable to location listings. So you couldn't when you use location listings, you use our built-in entity types. And so those are like location and restaurant and healthcare professional and healthcare facility. And those are dedicated to match to our publisher fields. We currently don't allow users to create custom entity types and custom fields and sync those to listings. And so being able to determine, because like there's this clear mapping between the description field in Yext for the location entity type and the description field on Google or on Facebook. So in a future world, you could imagine something where I can model my data however I want, and somewhere else in the UI, I pick like, okay, I actually want my location dot related, I don't know, some related facility dot something to power the Google description field, but that's not currently supported. So this is more specific to every use case that you would use Yext outside of location listing. So search pages, building applications on our APIs. Those are the kinds of things that modeling data flexibly like this works really well for. Things like Google Business Profile and other location listings publishers, it's not as applicable for.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. And thank you all for your attendance today, the great questions and the engagement. We really appreciate it. We're going to wrap for today. As always, though, if there are any remaining questions, feel free to access the Hitchhikers community, post your questions there, and you can expect to receive answers from our team in a short return. So again, with that, thank you all, and have a great rest of your week.